them. Whoops, sorry, that just popped up. So before we go further, I think Alicia's going to pop up a poll because I'm really interested to find out who's here and kind of what your backgrounds are.
So if you want to answer this question, your current nonprofit board member reality. So are you on a board, not on a board, thinking about joining a board, or a staff member maybe that's responsible for training? And we'll leave that poll up till we get to about 80% of folks. We're already at 70. You guys are fast, used to doing these. And then we'll share it with everyone before we continue. So, oh goodness, 90%, wow. Students, they take their time, a couple of minutes go by. You guys are on it. All right, so let me go ahead and share that with everyone. There you go.
Awesome. Okay, so that is great. 67% of you are currently on a board. That is terrific. We've got at least one person who is doing board training, a staff member who's doing that. And then we've got a couple of people who are curious. So, and people who've been on a board before but aren't now. Thank you for that. And it's good to know a little about you. So today, what we're going to be talking about, I love this little word art, get on board, because I feel like that is what we're trying to do here. We are trying to not only give information to people who are currently on boards, but also use this hopefully as a springboard to get new people involved in nonprofit boards. As we go forward, I want to tell you some of the slides that we have, they're pretty information dense. And if I was going to be doing this in person, I would just have it be where, you know, a little chunk would come up at a time. But I've read that that is really hard for people to keep up with online. So I'm not going to be rolling out each little section of a slide. It'll all be on the slide in front of you. So apologies in advance if you don't like that part. But wanted to give you that little housekeeping. So we're going to be talking today just about a lot of the benefits about serving on a board. We'll talk about that later. But for me, boards, I've served on boards for a lot of my life or worked with them. And that has been both some of my most rewarding and my most challenging experiences. And some of you, since so many of you have worked on boards before, you might be able to think that same way. Sometimes it can be challenging to work with a group of people who are so disparate. You might all have one thing in common. You're really excited about that particular organization, but also you all have different backgrounds. You have different opinions on things, and that can sometimes be challenging. But also, it's so rewarding. It is great to be able to work with nonprofit organizations to use the skills you already have, perhaps to learn some new ones, share your experiences. I know I have met some amazing people working in nonprofits, and a lot of them, I would not have had the perspective changes that have happened in my life if I hadn't met them. And so I think those are just some of the really good things about being a board member. So we're going to start going into some of the basics. And I want to say I want to set this foundationally is that we have in civil society a term civic engagement. And under that, we find 4 different kind of platforms or just different areas of civic engagement. And a couple of them, actually all of them really, volunteering and being on a board hits that. So civic action falls under the umbrella of civic engagement. And that's where volunteering, we play a really valuable role in shaping how we interact with the communities and how we develop our skills and our values. And we are empowered, I think, when we get involved with boards to become active citizens in different ways than maybe we would have. Coming out of this pandemic, it's interesting because research is showing that, you know, people want something new, and we're seeing that in the Great Resignation and different words that are popping out. But folks are looking even beyond jobs to take on different tasks, to work with new people, to have fresh opportunities to be connected in communities. And so volunteering, like you on boards, volunteers are looking for new ways to use these gifts and skills. And they're looking at it from different perspectives because the pandemic really has changed that. The civic commitment part, we see that all the time with people who serve on nonprofit boards and even volunteers for nonprofits, just people who are willing to make a positive contribution. Civic skills, that is just really being involved. It also tends to get to the politics and voting and democracy. And some of our organizations, though, do a significant amount of advocacy work that I think would fall under this area. And then being on a board or being a volunteer with a nonprofit really speaks to social cohesion too, and just this sense that we can work together and trust each other to help move things along in our community. So why serve? This postcard is actually one of our promo pieces for Nonprofit and NGO Studies. And this was taken the day after the polar vortex at NIU. It was the sunrise. And it seemed like a really perfect backdrop for this quote from Aristotle, asking, what is the essence of life? To serve others and to do good. So I'd love for you, while I'm chatting, to pop into the chat why you serve or why you might want to serve. I know that'll take a couple minutes. So while you're thinking of that, why do you want to serve on a board, or why have you? I'll say for a lot of us, it feels good. It gives us a sense of purpose and it kind of keeps us connected to each other. It's interesting. 1 in 4 Americans volunteer in the United States. In 2020, there were like 7.9, almost 8 billion volunteer hours. And that has an estimated time value of about $175 billion. It's a lot. Research shows that volunteering improves our health, and it does so, it strengthens our body, it improves our moods, lessens stress. There's other things that are really great about volunteering on a board or with just plain straight volunteering. And that is in a career builder study, 60% of hiring managers see the act of volunteering as a really valuable asset, and they count that when they're making recruiting decisions. And 93% of HR executives agree that working with a nonprofit can improve somebody's leadership skills. So I'm going to pop into the chat and just see a couple of the things that you guys are saying. Passion to serve. Okay, we've got religion gets into this too. And for a lot of us, it's part of our faith base. Yep, to just have a chance to give back, to honor somebody that we've lost. Yeah, there's so many different ways. I have a passion to serve that I've not been able to fulfill with my vocation. Perfect. Finding an opportunity that matches passion and skills, that's beautiful. We've got people saying that how vital it is for the health of the community. It's true. It's true. Commitment to the cause. This is awesome. These are really great. I hope you all are looking at these because these are really excellent, excellent reasons to be involved. Thank you for that. I'm glad to see all of those responses. And it's interesting because a government study reports that people who volunteer over 100 hours a year are some of the healthiest people in the United States. And not only does volunteering, we know from research, it lowers people's cortisol levels and blood pressure. But 98% of volunteers report volunteering enriches their sense of purpose and a connection to the community. So yay for that. So I know that a lot of you have been working with nonprofit boards or have before, but some of you haven't. So I want to make sure that we go back and we're going to talk about some of the basics of nonprofits and boards. You know, when we have students coming in to our program, they find the name of nonprofits to be confusing. So of course, like a nonprofit, you must not make any money. And any of you who have worked with a nonprofit know, of course, we do need to make money. That's the only way we can keep the doors open and the programs running. And so, yeah, that was maybe an unfortunate choice of names. But we'll talk a little bit more later, how more in depth about that. But nonprofit organizations, they belong to the community. There's no owner of nonprofit organizations, not individual owners. But the board of directors, they work together to make decisions that are in the best interest of the organization. And sometimes when organizations have been around for a little while, they might also have paid staff. So an executive director and other staff. And we'll talk about that a little later as well. So there are such different ways to serve, and there are so many different kinds of nonprofits. And again, when we teach our students more about nonprofits, they're stunned to know that there are like 10 different subsectors. So if I had asked you earlier about what organizations you had volunteered with, you may have told me that you have been serving food or working at a local food pantry. Maybe you have been teaching an after-school course to under-resourced children. You may have been working at a domestic violence shelter or at a museum. In my days, I've put up siding on houses. I've done a lot of the other things that you guys have probably done. So that is kind of a little bit of the basics. I just want to make sure that we're all clear. Nonprofits do make a profit, and also boards, while they're not the owners of the organization, they are the ones that really help make decisions for the organization. So on a board, board of director members are not employees and they're not paid. They can be reimbursed for certain things, mileage and expenses, but they're not normally paid. They meet as a group at least once a year, at least in Illinois. That is a requirement. I believe that is nationwide. But most boards do meet more than that. And they follow a set of bylaws that help them make decisions. We'll talk a little bit more about bylaws later. So the organization of the board typically includes officers or executive board members, and that can include a president, a vice president, a treasurer, or a secretary. And then there are normally other directors. When an organization first starts out, they might not have that many directors. In Illinois, you are just required to have at least 3 directors or officers. But when you think about the sizes of your boards, typically we try to have an odd number of board members, and that includes the officers. And it looks like the median these days is about 15. So that number, though, is very clearly outlined in your bylaws. And I don't know about you, I've been involved with some organizations who they've put pretty big ranges, like we're going to have between 7 and 20. And so that is an interesting way to handle it. But you definitely want to try to have an odd number. That just makes it easier when you are debating and voting on certain issues. So bylaws, those of you who've been on organizations before, you know, bylaws are the rules and the procedures that govern how the organization is run. Bylaws tell us a lot of things when they're done well. They tell us who's electing the directors, how many of them are there going to be, when actually are we going to hold elections, what's actually the process for board elections, do we have nominations, is there a group of people in the board who will be interviewing people, what will that look like? And then we also, your bylaws will tell us how long are the directors going to serve. So that's called a term. I've worked with nonprofits that a term is anywhere between 1 and 3 years and can be renewed 2 to 3 times, depending. Bylaws also tell us if we need to remove a director, how that happens. So bylaws, they're the document we're going back to all the time that tells us really the ins and outs, the intricacies of how we're running our board. So then we have board meetings. This is also outlined in the bylaws. We put in the bylaws how often our organization, our nonprofit board is going to meet. How often are we going to meet? How many directors have to be there at that meeting to make sure that we have quorum, that there's enough people that we can actually make decisions at a meeting. Bylaws tell us how much in advance the date of that meeting should be put out to members and to the public. So we have a little bit about the board meetings in there. Now that it's interesting with the pandemic, things shifted a little with online board meetings. I was not sitting on a board during the pandemic, but we are seeing a lot of repercussions now about how often boards are going to meet in person versus online. I think for a lot of boards, they found that they were really able to expand the people sitting on their board when they were able to expand geographies. So for instance, in Illinois, you just have to live in Illinois, but you could live any place in Illinois and be on an Illinois board. So the bylaws for many organizations probably will need to be amended to catch up with what happened in the pandemic. And if that has changed, the where, the when, and the how of meeting with boards. And then the bylaws also tell us with the officers, what are going to be the titles of our board officers. They come from the general board. What are going to be those titles? How are we going to elect them? And what will be their terms? So those are some of the really important parts about the bylaws. And so this is the end of the actual, just like the basics of nonprofits. So before I go forward, do we have any questions? If so, if you could go ahead and pop them in the chat.
So Julianne, I was just going to say, what positions have you served on boards yourself? Because they're different, your experience, and what roles have you had?
Yeah, are you asking people to put that in the chat, or?
Yeah, if you want to answer that, but other people as well.
Yeah, that would be great. So I've served just as a regular board member. In my most recent iteration, I served as the board secretary on the executive committee. That's a really different thing to be on the executive committee. And I found that I liked it because you get sometimes a different level of information, but also that can be a lot. It can be a lot.
So we have a question there about how often should bylaws be updated?
That is interesting. In organizations that I have been in, it actually is written in the bylaws how often the bylaws will be reviewed and updated. I've also been at least part of one nonprofit organization that had been in existence for about 10 years and the bylaws had never been updated. So there's, to my knowledge, not a requirement in the state of Illinois for when bylaws need to be reviewed.
Yeah, not to my knowledge either.
Yep. So I would say though that frequently looking at your bylaws is a really good idea. And at least one of the boards I have worked with in the past, they found themselves in a situation that they had not addressed how many terms somebody could have. They had listed the length of terms, could be 3 years, but they didn't say how many you could have. And so it was hard to make a change and open up that seat for somebody new. So kind of interesting. So I see we've got some, vice chairs in your second term. That feels good after you've done that a year or so, you really feel like you've got your feet wet and you're more understanding, I think, what's happening. 1 year as a director and now president of the board. Marcia, congratulations.
There was a question about how typical frequency of meetings are. I know you mentioned earlier that you're only required to have one a year, but are there typical a number of times that boards meet?
Yeah, it's interesting. That is something that the literature is showing really changed over the pandemic. Organizations, I know the last organization that I was with, we had moved from a monthly meeting to an every other month. What Leading with Intent was showing is that in the, that's a report that comes out of Board Source, that was showing that actually nonprofits started meeting more frequently, but for a shorter amount of time when they could get online. So it depends on your organization and what kinds of work can you get done in between meetings that doesn't need to be voted on. That often in some of the organizations I've worked with, they get a lot done in between meetings, like maybe if they're going every other month in the off month. That doesn't mean committees aren't still happening. On boards of directors, we have regular directors, we have officers, and then there are often committees, board committees. So those can continue to work. So I wouldn't say, I don't think that there's really a typical frequency of meetings. And Alicia, do you have a different take on that?
No, I think you're right. I think it depends on the work that needs to get done. And if you feel like you need to meet more often. I agree, during the pandemic, when decisions had to be made quicker, they had to meet more frequently. Typically, I think boards meet every other month or once per quarter, but it depends on the size of the board and if they can get that work done. We had another question about, is it important to have an executive committee? So legally, there's some requirements, and then there's in practice. Julianne, you want to comment on that?
Yes, exactly. And this does vary state to state, but in most states, you do have to have a president, a secretary, and a treasurer.
And that functions as your executive committee, whether you do that in practice or not, but those three positions function as your executive.
Yep.
There was another question around, is it important to develop your bylaws with a lawyer, or can you get good templates somewhere?
That is a great question. The last organization I was with came from a national organization. So we did have a template from our national organization. It's always a good idea to have, I think, an attorney look over bylaws. And there probably are really great templates online. To be honest, I don't know. I've never been with an organization that has used a template like that. But I feel like as the internet has exploded and we really have such great organizations out there, the National Council of Nonprofits, Forefront is the umbrella organization for nonprofits in Illinois. Maybe even the Secretary of State in Illinois has templates. That's a great question. Alicia, do you have an answer on that?
Yeah, I think you've given some good resources, and in the follow-up email to anyone who's registered, I'll also poke around and see if I can find some. There's very, some bylaws are very short and sweet, kind of just around term limits, how many positions. I've seen them as short as like 2 pages. They're pretty quick. Yeah. And then there are others who have really developed policies and procedures that end up in their bylaw, and so they're very, very long. It probably depends also on the sophistication of the organization. Bylaws tend to develop along with the organization.
Yeah. I was going to say that will be a fun thing to poke into to see if there are good templates out there. And I agree with Alicia. I have been definitely part of nonprofits that have very, very short bylaws. And I think that happens often when you're just starting a nonprofit. and or younger nonprofits. The last one I was with was a legacy organization. Like I said, it has a national and international home office. And so our bylaws were probably like, I don't know, 35 pages long. It was a lot. So that part depends. So, okay, well, great to know that we have such a mixture of people who are general members, people who are officers. Currently, we've got an executive director. Hey, Katie, good to see you. And kind of everything in between. So thank you for participating there. Okay, so we're gonna move on now to talk about the fiduciary or legal duties of board members. And I will tell you, this is an interesting thing. Sometimes when I do this presentation for a board, I'll get through this next part and the board members will be like, hold it, what do you mean? What do you mean that there's legal duties? Like, I'm just sitting on the board. But if you're a board member, you have a fiduciary duty. And I remember when I first started in this work, I had to look up, what does that mean that I have a fiduciary duty? So you'll see these things used interchangeably. A board member is a fiduciary, or you have a fiduciary duty, or you have legal duties. A fiduciary is a trustee. And that means that you have a responsibility to be in a trustworthy position between you and then the beneficiary. The beneficiary can be the people that you are working for, the people that you're serving, and also the community. So there are some legal duties, and there are 3 of them. So the first duty is duty of care. This one is, attend the meetings. What we're looking at on this is that you're prepared for the meetings, that you use your own judgment on things, that you conduct yourself in the ways that a reasonably prudent person would. I know that lately we are seeing, I don't know what the definition of reasonably prudent person and behavior, that seems to be changing a little. But I would say that in this one, like I said, make sure that when you're a board member, that you are reading the board packet. Normally you will get a packet of information before a meeting. So make sure you read through that so that you can be knowledgeable about what you're voting on. Regularly attend board meetings. A lot of organizations actually have it in their bylaws how many meetings somebody can miss in a year or in a row. And then again, I think a hard thing that needs to happen is to remember that duty of care also includes using our independent judgment. And I've absolutely been on boards and worked with people who have found themselves to be sometimes that it's difficult to stand up to members who are already on the board who have very strong voices and are very much opinionated. So duty of care is showing up and doing the work to make sure you're prepared. The duty of loyalty then means that you're placing the interests of the organization in front of your own personal interests. So the needs of that nonprofit organization come first. Sometimes that pops up with if you have a business. So maybe you are on the board because you're a banker. And so you just have to check yourself. You have to make sure that when a vote is taken, that you recuse yourself from that vote, because if you don't want to put yourself in a conflict of interest. Most organizations that I've worked with recently, probably in the past 5 or 6 years, have board members sign conflict of interest statements on an annual basis. And sometimes then they remind board members on a quarterly basis. It's something that comes up frequently, just reminding you that one of your legal duties is that you put the needs and the interests of the organization in front of your own. And that's something that you really do have to think through. I think for a lot of our organizations, the work we do is really complex. And even though we might not be working for an organization that could benefit, or our spouse isn't, we want to make sure that always the needs of the organization come first. And then the third duty is the duty of obedience. This is not a duty in all states, but it is in the state of Illinois. And in this, it is the responsibility of the board member to remain true to the mission and the vision and the purpose. And as a board, that you do that. And that you make sure that the organization is in compliance with actual documents, state documents, articles of incorporation, and any other applicable federal and state laws. It's not common, but board members have been held liable for issues that have popped up, either state, federal, and that's generally the IRS, or just general negligence. And one of the statistics I was reading is that in the past 5 years, like 48% of issues that came up were from not withholding taxes for the executive director. So it's interesting the kinds of things that a board can kind of get dinged on. Most organizations will have either general liability insurance or directors and officers insurance. Personally, for me, I don't sit on boards that don't have directors and officers insurance. But that's a thought that everybody can, that's a decision everybody makes for themselves.
Julianne, there's 2 questions kind of related to those in the chat.
Yeah,
just conflict of interest policy.
Yep. Yes, I would highly suggest that you do. I know many of the boards that I work with, that is written into the bylaws, and then that is also a specific conflict of interest statement that is written out. And like I said, annually, board members sign that. Also, even when we sign it, it's a really good idea to remind members, at least quarterly. But one organization that I was with in the recent past did it monthly, and there was a short blurb on every agenda about a conflict of interest. Just making sure that everybody is reminded at every board meeting. And then Martine, I see, can you talk about legal duties in a situation where spouses and family members are on the board and on staff? That can get very sticky. I have not specifically had experience with that. I'm trying to think. I have not had experience with that. I think in that, as long as each person is following the legal duties personally, that should keep you out of legal trouble, but it doesn't mean it would keep you out of just really sticky situations on the board.
And I think, Julianne, that brings up a good point, the difference between illegal activity and just maybe unethical activity, where, especially when you get into those situations where there's if there's a spouse on the board, but a staff member is related to that board member. And so there's some oversight of that staff, maybe even setting salary, it can get really strange. So again, not necessarily illegal, but something that you might want to avoid. And a lot of nonprofit boards start with family members, right? I mean, especially for small ones, that's not abnormal to have family members, multiple family members serving on the board. It just gets interesting if there's an oversight quality that the board member cannot be impartial.
Right. Yeah, and as Dorothy said, some boards don't even allow spouses to serve at the same time. Yeah, they're each, it's funny. Most of, I would say often, these things aren't written into bylaws until there's an issue. So it's always a great idea to be forward thinking when you're reviewing your bylaws and deciding how the organization is going to move forward. It's better to have things in place when there's not an issue than have to try to put things in place when you're in the middle of an issue. So those are the 3 legal duties. And as I said at the beginning, this is a time generally when board members are like, that illegal, this is maybe different than what I thought. I thought it was just going to be fun to be on a board and share my time. So it's good to know about these duties. There's the 3 legal duties. So now we're going to start talking about teams. And I want you to be thinking about this as we talk about those legal duties. And then we're going to be moving into a board structure. I want you to understand that when a board comes together, these teams are people who many have they've not known each other before. So nobody comes onto a nonprofit board, to a team perfectly developed. We hope to have some sort of shared vision about the organization and really be dialed into what their mission and vision are. Hopefully everybody can respect each other and their views and the talents and the things that they do bring to the organization. It is hard sometimes to communicate honestly and openly. And that is one of the things that I think boards, we'll talk about it a little later, that doing things in a social manner can sometimes help build some camaraderie with the team that helps us to understand each other better and makes communication sometimes a little easier. On boards, I think when we understand that, once we're past the legal things, that making mistakes, like not everybody's going to do everything perfectly, then I think that's really helpful to build a good board culture. And boards that, that do fun things together, they end up being boards that are really, they move the mission forward faster. So, excuse me, now we're going to move on to board structures. So I want you to think about the boards that you're working with or you have worked with in the past. In general, we look at basic board structures and we think newer boards, newer organizations tend to have a working board. Excuse me. So that means that the people who are on the board of directors are often the same people who are doing the actual work of the organization. And then on the other end of that is a fully just governing board. The board members there are simply governing the organization. They're not doing the work of the organization at all. And then there's the middle, the marvelous kind of murky middle. And I think probably every organization I've worked with is more in that murky middle than it is on either of the sides. I've only worked with one brand new board where the people at the board table were also the people doing the work. And I've been an observer for really well done governing boards, but I've not been part of one myself. And here's the thing I think about board structures to remember is that there's both an art and a science thing to running nonprofit organizations. There are a lot of quote unquote best practices. There's a lot of literature out there. So we can have really good guidance on how to run boards. However, that's the science part. The art part's a little different. And the art part comes up with, that really depends often on who's at the table, what is happening for the organization. So there's not one way to do this, and there's not actually specific ways that you can say like, oh yes, we're now in the middle, or we're now governing. It is kind of a continuum, and that's fine. But it's good to know when you're in a board, or if you're just interviewing to be part of a board, kind of what is their structure? Are they more at the beginning? Are they such a legacy organization that really you are simply governing, or are they in the middle, a little bit of a mixture? So in the working board model, like I said, that is often the place where most nonprofits start. It's a young organization phase. And at some point, though, normally in a working board, paid staff might be added on. As I said, the governing board model, that is more, they have paid staff. There's an executive director or CEO who is paid to run the organization. There's staff that do the work of the organization. And really what the board is doing is making sure that the mission and vision, the mission's being followed, that the vision is being completed, and that policies are in place to run the organization. And the board also is looking over to make sure that finances are in order, and that fundraising is happening, and that also the executive director is hired and then supported and reviewed and fired if need be. That marvelous murky middle place is where there might be staff that one or two people, or even a little bit more robust, that are working together to carry out the programs. And sometimes they work with board members who do that. Organizations I've been with in this middle area sometimes have some board members on them who perhaps have been part of the board for a while and are finding that it's very difficult to figure out whose role is whose. And you guys may have experienced this, where you have some board members who really believe that their ideas are maybe better than the paid staff, and that can be really some tricky things to deal with on a board. That kind of tension between board and staff, we generally don't see it in a working board or a governing board, but in that middle, that can happen as an organization is transitioning and growing. The things that we have to make sure that this transition is easier is to make sure that there are clear job descriptions for all the board members, and that there are very clear time expectations for board members as well. And then if you do have paid staff people, that there's very clear job descriptions for the executive director and for the staff people. Regardless of which of these three kind of basic board structures, though, that an organization is in, one thing is clear for all nonprofits, and that is good governance is the same through all three. And whatever level of structure that the board that you're working with is at, these principles remain the same. And that means that for the board, that they're accountable to their stakeholders, they are transparent about, especially financially, but otherwise also transparent about what they're doing. They're responsive to the needs of their community. They're very consensus oriented, working with the community, the people they serve, and then as a board too, that people who are on the board are very participatory. They're inclusive of people who don't have the same maybe visions or thoughts. These boards still, good governance says that we still follow the rule of law, and we do the best that we can do to be efficient at running the board. So those were some of the pieces, the structures, if you will, of nonprofit boards. So as we move then through a little bit, I want to talk about, there are general essential duties that all boards are charged with completing, and they might fall into three kind of main areas, and that is setting direction and strategy, providing oversight, and ensuring resources. These are three that really important, and we see most boards at least are doing these essential duties. And in Leading with Intent, that report from Board Source from 2021, the research that they did came up with some interesting statistics. 78% of the CEOs or executive directors who were part of the study indicate that they do have a formal strategic plan and have done some sort of work on framing out what their strategy is going to be. But only a third of CEOs and half of board chairs think that the impact of that strategy is positive or very positive. So it's interesting. We might have a strategy, we might have a direction, but we don't necessarily always think that, that's moving forward in a great way. 53% of boards who are reviewing CEOs annually and formally, and that comes under the providing insight or oversight. 53% say that that happens on an annual basis. 15% have done it, had a formal written review of their executive director in the past 12 to 24 months. And there was a shocking number of boards who had executive directors who had never, ever done a review of their CEO. So although these general essential duties, we see and we hear that these are the things that are really, really important to boards, we also know that sometimes these things aren't being done really well and with on a regular basis. So I'm kind of curious, for those of you who are currently on boards or have been, do you do annual reviews, written reviews of your nonprofit executive director or CEO if you have one? I'd love for you to pop that in the chat. Do a little straw poll here.
Yeah. And Julianne, it seems like there's a good number of no's. In your experience, what are some reasons why a nonprofit might not do that, even if they think that's probably a good idea, but they have hesitated to do it so far?
Yeah, I think even in some of the really developed boards that I have been with, especially if the CEO has a strong personality, people are afraid. They don't want to do it. The other thing, though, is they don't have good guidelines. There isn't a great job description for that CEO or executive director. And so there's not a good way to assess whether they're doing a good job or not. If you don't have a job description, it's hard to say if the person's doing a good job. And then from there, even in the job description, depending on how that's written, if you don't have a way to assess if the person's doing a good job, it's hard to have a review. I have also been part of boards where they had a very, very slim job description for the CEO. And when they just didn't like the CEO, they did have a review. And basically, they really didn't have a leg to stand on because they didn't have any details. They just didn't really like the person. And that ended up being a lawsuit. So I think it does go back to having good job descriptions. And I think we do that for board members too, and have some ways of understanding for your CEO, what does doing a good job actually mean? Okay, so we are now going to move on to, although these were some general essential duties, there's actually the 10 essential duties that are generally accepted. Some of them fall under these three major ones, but there are 10 generally accepted essential duties for nonprofit boards. So, essential duty 1, determine the organization's mission and purpose. It's the board's responsibility to create and review a statement of mission and purpose that articulates the goals of the organization. And generally, that also kind of tells us how that's going to happen and who the primary constituents are going to be. So determining the organization's mission and purpose is an essential duty of the board. The next one is providing proper financial oversight. And that means that the board must assist, they develop the annual budget. Sometimes they do that if there's staff, they do that in conjunction with the staff. But then they also make sure that proper financial controls are in place. And that is to make sure the board has oversight to make sure that the funds that people either donate or if the organization's getting money elsewhere from grants or state or federal grants as well, that money the budget's being looked over and that there are proper controls in place to make sure that nothing untoward is happening with the money. The third essential duty is to ensure adequate resources. And that means that one of the board's biggest responsibilities is to make sure that there's adequate resources, which generally means financial resources. Now, that doesn't mean that the board themselves have to come up with all of the funding, but it is within their purview to make sure that they are using networks, that they are going out and searching for multiple sources of income and other resources for their organization. The fourth essential duty is ensuring legal and ethical integrity, maintaining accountability. So it's the board that's ultimately responsible for making sure that the nonprofit organization is adhering to legal standards. That might mean that they're making sure that there is a CPA who overlooks the budgeting process and the tax process. It might mean that the board is really taking care to watch over what are the HR hiring practices that the CEO or if they have a different person who does hiring, staff hiring. So it's up to the board to make sure that there's some legal integrity and that when people donate and financially support with their time, talent, or treasure, support that organization, that there is a knowledge that that time, talent, and treasure is being used well. The next one is ensuring effective organizational planning. And that just means that boards and specific board members actively participate in the overall planning process and that they are assisting with monitoring the strategic plan goals and implementing them if there's not staff. So we're not going to get into strategic planning deeply here. That would be a whole other workshop that Alicia would do.
I'm doing one in June in case people really want to come.
yeah. Like she was saying, she did one last weekend that I came with, kind of a mini strat planning, and it's amazing just when a board has a very clear strategy, when they are organized in a way that helps them implement and monitor the goals of that strategic plan, like how much faster an organization can move forward. Determine, monitor, and strengthen the organization's programs and services. It's the board's responsibility to determine which programs are consistent with the organization's mission and then to monitor their effectiveness. I know that this has been, in boards that I sat on, this has been a really hard thing. when you have a large paid staff, sometimes the staff is like, yeah, no, we'll monitor those programs. And it's easy for a board to not be involved in that sort of thing. But it's really important. It is an essential duty for a board member to know what kinds of programs the organization is putting out, to know the work that the organization is doing, and also to know that there's some assessment with that we are making sure that those programs are good, that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, that they're helping the community. And so that is a big essential duty, I think, of a board that sometimes gets overlooked. Also enhance the organization's public standing. I think this is sorry about that. I think this is an interesting one. I think that sometimes board members get on a board and they think that they go to the meetings, they vote during the meetings, they give money, and they're done. But really, we need more than people's money. We need their networks, and we need their ability to advocate for the organization. So a board member, the board and a board member, should be able to clearly articulate an organization's mission, what its accomplishments are, what kinds of programs they're doing, and the goals. And they should be able to do that to the public and to the broader community. I've definitely been on boards where I have worked with them, including boards I've sat on, to make sure that all of the board members had a board pitch, that they were able to do kind of an elevator pitch about the board or the work of the organization. And it's so fascinating because, you know, a lot of kind of high-powered people who had high-level jobs, attorneys and CEOs of other corporations and that sort of thing. And getting people to come up with their own elevator pitch for the organization was like pulling teeth. But it's really important to do that. It's important to know that at any given time, if I'm standing in the line at Schnucks and somebody sees that I have, you know, a safe passage bag, that if somebody asks me, oh, what's safe passage, that I'm able to clearly articulate what safe passage does, why it's a good thing for the community, and how that person might be able to get involved or find us. And so enhancing the organization's public standing, that is not just a job for staff, it is the job of every single member of that board. And then we're in the home stretch here. Nonprofit boards are the ones that select the chief executive officer if there is a paid chief. They have to reach a consensus on what the responsibilities of that chief executive are going to be. And then they have to do a search to make sure that they have the most qualified individual for the position, not just my husband or you know, my son or the founder necessarily. When you get to that point where you have a paid chief executive, that is the duty of the board. And that is interesting. I've been on boards where, or worked with them, where they have really just put out a kind of the notice into the community and had people apply that way. I don't even want to say sometimes that they've applied. Sometimes it's, there haven't been a lot of maybe people who sign up to be or apply to be the chief exec. And so just somebody who says yes ends up being the chief exec. But in most of the other organizations that I've worked with, there's a lot of different ways that you can find staff people. And now with the internet, we can put stuff out on Indeed and all kinds of different job boards. We can, here in DeKalb County, you can go through DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership and they post jobs. In bigger boards, I've actually worked with executive search firms who look for the new chief executives, and that comes from statewide or even beyond that. So selecting the chief, it can be a big and important piece for a nonprofit board. And then if there is a chief exec, then it is the duty of the board to not only have hired that person, but then support them. They are the morale boosters for that chief executive, and they are the support that that person needs. And so we support the chief exec, but then also we assess and we make sure that we are measuring their performance so that the mission of the organization can move forward. And then finally, the board recruits and orients new board members and assesses their performance. Now, definitely in, I would say board structures that are more like the middle ground or the governance ones, that often is it's a partnership between the executive officer or executive director and the board president, who help recruit and orient new board members. And one thing I think most
oh, Julianne froze for me. I don't know if she, or she might be looking at her internet connection, kind of slows down. While she reconnects here, let me just send her a chat so she knows. Okay. There you go. Wait, are you coming back?
Am I back?
There you go. You're back.
Yay. Okay.
Yay.
Oh, it just popped up that my internet connection's unstable. Yay.
There you go.
So we were talking about recruiting new board members and then assessing board performance. And I think that up until recently, we have seen from the literature that often how recruiting new board members, how that happens is, oh, my term's almost up. So like each one replaces themselves, which that's not a really great way to recruit new board members. It's one way, but what ends up happening is we often replace ourselves with people who look like us and they think like us and they have similar backgrounds to us. And that does not help a board grow and have new perspectives. So one of the duties of a nonprofit board is definitely to go out and recruit new members. And then a really big step is when you have that new member, then to orient them in a really thorough and good way. I have definitely been part of boards where, hey, you are a board member now. So like stop and pick up the binder and then read through it. And if you have any questions, let us know. That has been, I think, a not abnormal way of orienting board members. And my last board assignment, I took that on to make sure that we did that differently, that before somebody even became a board member, that they had a very good understanding of what we did. And we put together short videotaped little segments so that somebody who is interested in being a board member could learn more about the organization and not just be handed some big binder filled with all kinds of information. So those are the 10 essential duties. Questions on that? I'm going to pop into the chat. Oh, yep, Ellingsworth, we're going to talk about a couple of challenges with boards based on pandemics coming up in a minute. Yep. Okay. I just hired one planning staff. Okay, so no questions on the essential duties? Good. Okay, we are now moving on to some of the common challenges. So the pandemic really did change some things. And before I go into specific challenges for boards, I want to talk about what we are seeing now for 2022 volunteer trends that are coming up, because I think that impacts what things will look like for our boards. So what the research is showing is that definitely people are feeling, looking for a way to feel connected to the community. We were isolated for a really long time. So we have to remember that board members are volunteers, and that people who might be coming onto our board, one of the reasons that they're doing so is because they want to feel connected to the community. We also are finding that people in general wait, and I don't actually think this is a pandemic related, but people wait for a personal invitation, which makes it hard for boards, because how do you recruit? Where do you recruit? And we've also seen in this past year for sure that virtual volunteering is here to stay, and same with virtual board meetings. So that those two things are going hand in hand, and we'll talk about those a little bit more. I think the trends that we're seeing kind of are reminding us that in general, all of us are thinking more about life and loss, and we're evaluating our fundamental priorities and deciding what is worthy of our time and our talent. Volunteers used to think, or you hear a lot, somebody says that they're interested in an organization, but oh, somebody else will do the work. So we do need to figure out ways to reach out to people. I'm unstable again, so hopefully you're still hearing me. And like I said, internet's here to stay. So per board source, and I'm just going to buzz through these really quickly, some of the common challenges in the last 3 years, and I would say, and I think Alicia would agree with me, that some of these common challenges have been around forever. And that is the tendency for boards to veer off their mission. Those of you who have been on boards before, you have seen this and you have heard this. It is an organization maybe that does after school reading clinics for kids. And all of a sudden they are now having like moms and dads come too. And then on weekends, they're doing reading for anybody in the city. Those are not bad things, but they are if those things aren't in the mission. And so we've seen for a long time that veering off the mission, it's easier than you'd think, happens frequently, and it's a challenge for boards. I think when we've been on a board for a long time, we can get complacent about things. And sometimes our motivations can become a little bit misguided. I think one of the common challenges that I have seen is a tendency towards micromanagement, whether that is from the board chair or from the executive director who wants to have a bigger voice in what's happening with the board. Limitless terms popped up from board source. And I think that is an interesting thing. As I discussed earlier, definitely worked with some boards that they didn't have term limits and for board members, and then found it hard to replace certain members. Lawless governance is something that popped up for board source, and that is when boards start governing without looking at their bylaws, and they just make decisions that aren't based on any of the rules or regulations that they've set for themselves. No board assessment is something that is a common challenge, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. And that goes hand in hand with a lack of self-improvement, both for the board and individual board members. So we'll dive into that a little bit more. And then knotted purse strings, which for board source just meant that there weren't clear ways for the board to figure out where money should be spent. and that sometimes we keep doing things in a board because we've always done it, and we can't untie the knot of that spending. So those were some of the common challenges just listed out from Board Source. But I've talked a couple times about this Board Source report, Leading with Intent, and we'll put a link into it with the email that we send. And this is from 2021, based on some data that came through during the pandemic. And we already talked about boards. People feel disconnected from their community, but in specific, boards are disconnected from the communities and the people that they serve. And I think I'd love for you guys to think about your organization and think about, does your board, does it reflect the makeup of the population that you serve? I can tell you the last several boards that I worked with, it absolutely did not. It did not reflect what our community was, and it for sure didn't reflect the people that we served. So there's a disconnect that way. And it's interesting, in this Leading with Intent research, almost half of CEOs, chief executives, said that they feel like they don't have the right people on their board to establish trust within the community that they serve. But those same boards, only a third of them place an actual high priority when they are recruiting board members on a knowledge of the community served. That's not something we generally ask about. And even fewer boards placed a high priority on actually being a member of the community that is served. And that it's such a huge area that I'm interested in figuring out how we can do a better job of making sure that the people we serve have a place at the table, at the board table. I have always thought that we should not be serving them without having their voices. And that definitely came out loud and clear in this last round of research, Leading with Intent. But that's actually been in the research for a couple of years. And it seems like boards have not been able to figure out how to reconnect with the communities and how to invite people from communities, especially the community that's being served, onto boards. Leading with Intent also talks about the fact that boards that prioritize fundraising above all else, I mean, every board I've ever known, they definitely prioritize fundraising. But those that have that above all else, they do so at the expense of strategy, relevance, and impact. And it was interesting, chief executives that reported placing the highest level of importance on fundraising had lower ratings in multiple areas. So we see that just fundraising is not the thing that boards want to be doing. We know they have to do some, but that can't be everything. Boards and executives should reflect on what's prioritized in terms of board expectations and how their board time is spent. In this research, both board CEOs and board chairs reported that not enough time was being spent on building a diverse and inclusive board, and that boards were not being strong with their commitment to equity. So we know that that is an area that we can do better on going forward. And then the fourth big highlight from this report was that clear expectations of board service really have a huge impact most when it comes to the board's overall culture, the health of that board, and how people who are on the board, how they feel about the work of the board. So some interesting and also not surprising findings, I think, from Board Source. So I'm going to hop into, okay. So we're going to quick move on. What makes a good board member then? So good board members focus on listening, not just participating. And probably those of you who have been on boards have been with people who participate all the time, but don't hear what each other.
Oh, Julianne froze for a second, so we'll just pause. We're getting close to 8 o'clock. So if you do have any questions that you want to pop into the chat, please put them there. We'll be sure to answer them before we sign off. So I want to make sure that if there are any burning questions that we did not cover during the presentation, that we get a chance to do that. And I've been taking notes, making sure that all the resources that Julianne mentioned will be in the email, the follow-up email to you. So you'll have the leading intent one, but lots of other resources that we use, both from Forefront, Candid, Board Source, all of those folks. Some free board self-assessments. There's a few. Board Source does have a paid service, but there's also some free board assessment surveys that are out there. So we'll be sure to get those to you too. Any questions that I can answer as Julianne kind of hops back into the conversation. Is she back? She's back. There we go.
Hey.
Yay.
Okay, am I still sharing or no?
No.
Okay, so let me go back.
I did just say while you were gone, I just said if you want to pop in any other questions that to make sure, because I know we're getting close to time. We only have about 10 minutes.
Yep, and I apologize. It's so weird. I don't normally have this kind of, I don't normally have issues. But in this,
it's a long time. It's an hour and a half too. So
yeah, in this past week though, it has been interesting. My electricity and my internet has gone out multiple times. There's some construction happening near my house, and so it's
maybe times. Yeah.
Another thing that is really helpful for what's making a good board member is understanding the balance between letting an executive director manage operations and the board members helping with that when they can, but letting the executive director do their job. And that is another thing that probably could be a full session on how to manage that. We talked a little about a good board member being an ambassador for the organization, and then also remaining energetic about the work of the organization. So there are a couple things that we can think about individually as board members, and I think we can get better individually. And I think a couple of these things are easy to do. Make sure we're setting aside time each week to do the work of our board. Put it on your calendar if you need to. I needed to block out a significant amount of time for our board packets when they came out. Our board member or meetings used to be on Mondays, and we would get the board packet on Friday night. I would have to make sure that I blocked out multiple hours on Saturday or Sunday so I knew what we were talking about on Monday. And that shouldn't happen, actually. Board packets should come out at least a week in advance. But you can set aside time each week to make sure that you are doing the work of the board. Individually, we can think of our own goals. What's our goal? What's an area that we want to get better at so we can help the board move forward? We can speak up more, and especially if we think that board training is needed. I've been on boards where we all knew that we needed more training in something, but there wasn't really anybody to do it. And nobody would even say that we needed training. But that helps everybody when we're well trained. So individually, we can try to educate ourselves and then educate the rest of the board. And Alicia had mentioned this before. I think considering a board scorecard is a real way to be able to make sure that people individually and as a group can get better. In a board scorecard, we track our efforts individually. How much time are we spending? Are we giving money back? Those kinds of things. So getting better as a board, I think as an entire board, means kind of going back to the basics sometimes, reviewing our mission and the articles of incorporation, making sure that our bylaws are updated. As a board, we could have confidential board surveys on the governance process. We could do some mini assessments. We can do easy SurveyMonkey surveys, just asking like, hey, how are we doing? How do each of us really think we're doing as a board? As I said before, the board might decide like, yeah, we don't know much about this. And so training sessions are a really great way. There's a lot of things available like this webinar tonight. You can have people come to your board. There are tons of training, like little component pieces online, but figuring out what training sessions you need to help you get over the lack that the board has. Again, a board scorecard that keeps track. We ended up doing a paper scorecard in my last board, but then we moved it to an online like SurveyMonkey so that quarterly I could let people know what was their attendance like, what was their giving like. We had like 7 different areas that we wanted our board members to be involved in. And we were able at the end of the year then to have a really good overview of how we were doing as a board in areas that the board thought was important. But if you don't have those set out and then you are not assessing them, you won't be able to know. And then another way to get better as a board is to spend time together socially. And recent research on this has shown that boards that spend between 5 and 8 hours a year just doing some social things. So not the work of the board and not specific work for the social things for the organization, but time together socially just as a board, those boards had a very significant increase in board member satisfaction and also their thoughts on how well they were moving forward the organization. Now, that same study was also really interesting because more than 10 hours had a very significant decline in how people felt about the board. So there is that sweet spot, like we want to be together socially, but not that much. That ends the evening, just the foundations of board service. So I know when I had cut out, there were people had to hop out. And is there anybody else who has any questions as we finish up, wrap up?
Julianne, do you want to stop sharing and we'll see you and then we can maybe see folks?
Yeah, I was going to just quick show though, if you need to get in touch with us, either Dr. Shadaman or I, here's our email, and you can even just go online, niu.edu/nonprofit, and you will find us.
And I have a good long list of resources that you had talked about and some other things that'll go out in the email tomorrow morning.
Yep, perfect.
So you'll get that, and then you can follow up directly with Julianne and myself if you have more questions. But I do appreciate everybody for coming. This is one of our, one of our thoughts doing for a webinar about boards was to hold it in the evening. So we really were hoping that we would get more board members than if we do it during the day. And it looks like that is true. We had over 100 people register. So we're really happy that you could spend this time in your evening with us for sure. I want to thank Julianne for bringing all of her expertise, both from the classroom, her personal experience on boards, her previous experience working with organizations. I really appreciate you sharing all of your background and experience with everybody here tonight. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun. And thanks to all of you for popping in on the polls and the chat. It's so interesting to see what we're doing here in the community, and community, not just DeKalb County, but all over. So thank you for your participation tonight too. And thank you for your grace while my internet decided to be naughty a couple times.
That we're in that time, right? We're in that time.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great evening and good luck with your board service.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.